Tim and Alex didn't really have much time to address the topic of discussions that we wanted to do in chapter 9 and 10. So we're going to give a chance for Tim and Alex to revisit.
To the Jews, I became a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. 21, to those who are without that law, like one without the law, not being without God's law, but within Christ's law, to win those without the law. To the weak, I became weak in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that I may be every possible means save some. Now I do all this because of the gospel. So I may become a partner in its benefits. He's a very good talker. I believe this is one of the reasons why Jesus chose him, because he can really talk and he knows how to talk. He knows his target audience and he knows how to adapt himself as in bring up the right words to talk to that particular audience. Deductive is you tell the point first and then you explain later. And then inductive is give a story, explanation, and then the punchline at the end. So what is the real subject matter here? Sister May gave us a hint in 12, 15, and 19. And if you read this, right, you can see Paul is telling them, hey, look, guys, you're complaining, but you know, I also entitled to what everybody or the apostle is getting, you know, that kind of stuff. But I choose, and basically he don't want to take it, but instead he wants to serve the people. And his objective or his main goal is that the gospel of Jesus Christ goes out to the people. And so that's why I share this slide. Joy comes when you put Jesus first, the gospel first, then others, the people around you whom you are sharing the gospel with, and you are last. What is the real problem here besides just eating idol food? So you know from the question itself, or rather, when you read chapter 10, it's not talking about the clean and unclean food, but it's talking about the food that has been offered to idol. And why I say 10 is nice, because Paul, how he wants to like teach them is remind them. Hey, you remember the time of Moses? You know what those fellows did? You know what your forefathers did? Those time God provided everything. You know, they had to go through everything. And when somebody did something wrong, somebody got punished. As simple as that. So he was using past mistake, bring forward to today. So in short, point to ponder, you can see the arrangement that's in the Bible. I'm using Holman. So chapter 8 talks about food offered to idols. And then chapter 9 gave an example as he is the apostle. And chapter 10, he gave the past, Israel past, he gave all the warning. And he also gave the warning about idolatry and Christian liberty.
So if we are not supposed to eat the idols so that our brother doesn't stumble, so can we eat alone or not? Can we eat alone so that nobody is watching?
Pastor say Adonai knows.
A good point, Peter. That's a good point. But the main issue here, guys, is not really the food. The main issue was that the Corinthians were still worshipping idols. You can see that in chapter 8 verse 10, where they were still dining in the temple. Some of them may be just dining in the temple just for the food's sake. But when the person sees from outside, you could be seeing that, hey, look, these Christians are still worshipping idols. The biblical principle behind it is that when you eat that food that is offered to idols, you have to, in your mind, think, how do I consider the idol? Is it just statues or is it a God himself? Then your conscience or your feeling will tell you, look, can you eat or not? If you eat it, is it really eating something that is sacrificed to, Paul uses a very strong word later called demons. Would you eat food that offered to demons? Alex has given some good tips already. Is Jesus first, others next, and yourself last. That's what Paul is talking about. Don't do anything that will cause anybody else to stumble, even yourself. Good. So we leave the food behind for a while. We're going to another minefield, another hot potato now, even hotter than the idol food. And I pass it down to Tim May.
And What were the three issues that were covered in chapter 11, 12 is basically three things. One is pertaining to head covering. Second is pertaining to Lord's Supper and self-examination. And the third thing is about diversity in spiritual gifts. So Paul says, judge for yourself. But before you judge for yourself, there are a few important things to note. And number one, and that is, if you really search the Bible, you can't find head coverings mentioned in any of the laws. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And second thing, I think Alex has already covered, we need to understand a little bit about Paul. And that is, number one, Paul does not always quote the command. He does occasionally give his opinion. You can find that in chapter 7, verse 25. And Paul, like Alex mentioned just now, he's always adaptive to culture. So whoever he is, he will adapt to the culture. So what problem is Paul really addressing here is more of a cultural issue and not really an issue of the law. So the question is, why did Paul advise for women to cover her head? First, understand what was Paul's thought pattern from the very beginning. Thought pattern meaning if you were to explore it from a mountain view, what is the ultimate message in each of the every chapter? So if you can see in many chapters, these were the issues that the Corinthians were facing. So when he talked about division, ultimately the bigger picture, he was trying to tell the people to be in harmony with each other. What he was doing is he was trying to point everyone to God. So if you think along this thought pattern and then you decide, hey, why did Paul advise to cover the head? As Paul was really encouraging modesty. Why? To prevent temptation, because sexual immorality was already an issue in the community. So, and his thought pattern is like, I want you to focus to God, avoid distraction as many as possible. So that could be one reason why he was encouraging modesty. Secondly, perhaps he was also emphasizing the importance of separation, distinction between holy and evil, because in pagan practices, it's quite common for men to cover their head. Vice versa, it's common for women to uncover their head during pagan meeting. And perhaps here he was trying to really say, you need to have a distinction between pagan worship and Christ worship, so that when people outside, your brothers outside look at you, there's a clear distinction and you won't cause a brother to fall, so to speak, along that manner. Perhaps ultimately he's just trying to say that Christ is the head, because if you really look at chapter 11, and if Paul is using a deductive method whereby he puts his theory first and then explain later, he starts off the chapter saying head of every man is Christ. And everything comes from God. And women's hair is given as pride of joy, is given to her. And he ends the chapter by saying, but if everyone wants to argue about this, I simply say, we have no other custom than this, neither do God's other church. Then we move on to the second issue that was addressed in chapter 11. And here again, if we put a deductive reasoning, he starts off the chapter 11, verse 18 by saying, first, I hear that there are divisions among you when you meet as a church. So what are the important lessons taking all this into consideration is number one, Lord's Supper essentially is talking about communion. He said, wait for one another. Don't eat ahead of each other. Some go hungry, some gets drunk. Come together, again, come together in unity. And when you do it in remembrance of God. Again, he's pointing everyone to remember that everything comes from God. Examine yourself. And remember that Jesus has selflessly sacrificed himself for us. Chapter 12, we know that it was a question that the Corinthians wrote to Paul in one of the letters. And I believe there was some confusion pertaining to, hey, how come certain people had certain spiritual gifts and why I do have that and why others don't have that. So he started off explaining that even though there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, different kinds of service, different ways, but again, he's pointing that all those, although different, comes from the same source, same Spirit, same Lord, same God. Why? It's because a spiritual gift is given to each of us so we can help each other. To further strengthen his message, he gave this illustration, which I really like, right? He's talking about how our body works, and we really function well only if we have every single part of our body. And the eyes can't tell the arms that, hey, I don't need you, or the ears can't say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, and the legs can't say, I'm not a hand, and therefore I don't belong to the body. That God has put the body together such that extra honor and care are given to those parts that has less dignity. This makes harmony among the members so that all members care for each other. And if one part suffer, all the parts suffer with it. And if one part is honored, all the parts are glad.
Are there churches or are there Christians that cover their head today, currently? If you can see my slide, these are some of the Christian groups that have their women cover their heads, even in church today. So, does Utama Beacon women have to cover their heads as well to make sure that they go in line with Paul's commandment? This is one of the hot topics that have been discussed, and there are still churches, even in Malaysia, that have their women cover their heads. So, what does the head covering symbolize? When I put a shawl on my head, what does it symbolize? The Bible always gives us the answer. And by the way, this is how the Greeks used to dress up their hair. And Corinthians are basically Greek. So imagine if the women were to come to church dressed up like this. What would be the first impression, or what the first thing you notice if you were sitting behind one woman with such a high bun? And by the way, the bottom one is the man. And Paul doesn't just talk about the women. He talks about men having long hair, which is unacceptable. So what is basically Paul talking about? Is he talking about humility or modesty? That you shouldn't have this kind of hair because this is the culture in Corinth? The answer is just here. Okay, the answer is in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 10. May, can you read this?
For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head.
Right. Paul is here talking about modesty is one issue, but authority. You can see the whole chapter. I don't know why he wants to focus on women, but the whole chapter is about authority. As much as the other chapter that talk about unity. But very important for us to realize is that with unity, we must recognize authority. When we recognize authority, then the church has order. And from all these future chapters are talking about church structure and church order. So here it says the woman ought to have a sign of authority over her head. So when I put a shawl over my head, and he actually explains it, and if you want to read, you read verse 3. Verse 3. Can you read verse 3?
Home, verse 3, but I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ.
Right. So there is certain hierarchy. And here man and woman is not talking about man and woman, it's husband and wife. No other man can claim authority over any another woman except for the husband. So here it says that the woman, the man is the head of the woman, and we understand that because of what? Because of Eve's sin. Men and women were created equal, but after Eve's sin, then women's status was downgraded. You can read that in Genesis chapter 3 and 4. So man is the head of the woman, and then Christ is the head of man, and God is the head of Christ. What is he talking about? He's basically in this chapter talking about authority. In church, as far as we want unity, there must be authority. And who is the head of the church? Who is the head? The pastor is the head of the church. You are not the head of the church. The church elder is not the head of the church. Neither is the church board the head of the church. The pastor is the head of the church. So authority must be established. And he uses this example for the women. It's a cultural thing or a local thing or a global thing? What do you guys think?
A local. I think Paul always addresses to the certain churches. So basically, most of the time he addressed to that particular church.
Yeah, some things are local, some things are global, but even though some things are localized, there can be a biblical principle that can be derived from this local issue. But this is most likely a local issue because of this. Is it the head or the hair? What do you all think? When Paul is referring to the woman's head or the woman's hair? If you read the verse, actually the hair is the crowning glory, yeah? Rose, the crowning glory of the woman. And sometimes they like to elevate their crowning glory when they come to church. with all sorts of hairstyles. So he says that put this so that the authority must be established. All right, the authority is still the pastor or the leader of the church.
Amen.
So there are things that he wants to teach here. So it's basically the covering of the women at that point in time. So question, should women cover their head in church today? So if yes, means that this is a global issue. If no, means that it was a local issue that is not applicable today unless it is your choice. Paul is addressing the issue of authority. I can remove my head covering now because I have the authority from pastor to teach this class. Then after that, he talks about those who are basically very greedy when they go for Lord's Supper. By the way, Lord's Supper is only mentioned here. Only here is it mentioned and used today as the communion service, which is the Lord's Supper. And that is actually talking about discipline. See, now he's talking about how the church should run. First thing, there must be authority. As far as unity is concerned, but there must be authority. Second thing, he's talking about discipline. Don't come to church and start to become like a glutton, greedy, and eat everything and in the potluck. Of course, here he's talking about the Lord's Supper. Then after that, he talks about the spiritual gifts. The spiritual gifts is talking about diversity. It's talking about diversity, that every part is important. Now, here it's talking about spiritual gift. There's a difference between spiritual gift and talents. I am talented in singing, right? But it is not necessarily a spiritual gift. These are spiritual gifts. Firstly, apostles, prophets, teachers, miracles, healing, helping. Some people are very good at helping, leadership, and of course, the ability to speak in tongues or unknown languages. That the arm, the leg, the toe, the eye, there is no issue of value here. Same thing as women, as far as women is concerned in the previous chapter. When talk about authority, it does not mean that man is above woman, woman is less valuable. Here is mainly talking about hierarchy but not value. It does not mean that women are less valuable, because Paul does say that your little toe in your foot is as important as your heart, is as important as your eyes. So though it's diversity, but everybody is valuable in the eyes of God. That's why he says at the end of chapter 12, I will show you a way beyond comparison. That's what May was trying to say. That after all this, I want to tell you what is the most important. And we still have some time. I'll pass it on to Tim Val. What is the most important issue here?
Okay, 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3. Paul told the Corinthians that gifts of tongues, prophesy, faith, and giving to the poor will gain nothing if there is no love. So basically, Paul is trying to teach the Corinthians about love. And 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7 is teaching them what is love. Love is patient and kind, not jealous, boastful, proud, or rude. Love does not demand its own way, not irritable, and thinks no evil. Love does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices in the truth. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. So 1 Corinthians 13, 8-12, Paul repeated that prophesying, speaking in tongues, and knowledge will all be useless as they are incomplete and limited. All will only be complete when God's people see him face to face. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 13, he reminded them that faith, hope, and love will last forever, and the greatest of these is still love. So basically, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul was trying to tell the Corinthians that the real problem at hand was not whose spiritual gifts are greater than the others, but rather the issue was their lack of love for one another. And Paul was teaching the Corinthians that the best way to love, to live, and to serve as Christ's followers is without comparing spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 14, 1-19. Paul continued to encourage the Corinthians to go after a life of love to proclaim God's truth. He told them that it is more important that everyone can have access to the knowledge and love of God by using language that everyone understands than to seek God's presence in a mysterious prayer language. In so doing, everyone in the church will be blessed. In private prayer, one can be spiritually free and expressive, but when in a church example for worship, it is better to say 5 words that everyone can understand than say 10,000 that sound like gibberish. 1 Corinthians 14, 20 to 25, Paul quoted from Isaiah 28, 11 to 12, "In strange tongues and from the mouths of strangers, I will preach to these people, but they'll neither listen nor believe." It shows that speaking in tongues will only bring confusion to unbelievers, but speaking God's truth using plain words will bring conviction and bring people to worship God. And in 1 Corinthians 14, 26 to 39, these are the instructions given by Paul for worship. Be prepared to uplift each other in singing, teaching, giving testimony, or in prayer. Speakers should take turns to speak in orderly manner. God brings harmony if we worship the right way. Women should be silent and be guided by God's law and their customs. If a person claims himself a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that the things mentioned is a command from the Lord. Lastly, do not tell how one should or should not pray when they are praying in tongues, but all things must be done properly and in an orderly manner. He had to remind them not to seek gifts in order to exalt themselves, but to seek gifts that they might serve God better and bring more help to his church.
1 Corinthians chapter 13. You will hear this a lot at weddings. It's just basically talking at the end of the day is Paul is saying what is more important is love for each other. That's the reason why Paul gave up his rights as an apostle. That's why he prefers to preach free of charge so that he can bring the gospel of love of Jesus Christ to everyone. That's the reason why he would rather not eat certain food to cause a brother to stumble rather than continue to indulge. That's why if you go to church and there's not enough food, we would rather to stay hungry than that our other brother is hungry. That's things that basically he is talking about. Is that at the end of the day, do you have love for people or not? Do you have love for people? Or in the church that not everybody speaks at the same time, and he would prefer if you prophesy and not rather than speaking in tongues. I wonder what is he talking about? It's better that you prophesy rather than you speak in tongues, because a lot of churches today, especially the Pentecostal churches, will advocate that you must speak in tongues if you want to receive or you want to manifest the power of the Holy Spirit. So what does he say here? Why is prophecy more better than speaking in tongues? Prophets are basically mouthpiece of God for the edification of the church. It's not for your self-edification. So basically that's right. If I can prophesy means I can speak the word of God, I can teach the word of God, and it can benefit the people. It's better than me speaking some unknown language that nobody understands, even though it sounds so impressive. That is what Paul is talking about. At the end of the day, there must be order, there must be authority, there must be discipline. All this is talking about the church structure. But finally, he says the final word. And what is the final word? And now these 3 things remain: faith, hope, and love. But what is the greatest? Love. The greatest of this is love. You can have all the faith in the world, you can have all the hope. You can know the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. But if you have no love for your brothers and the sisters, then really it's of no use. So let's all remember as we finish this lesson, there can be a lot of contentions about idol food as well as about covering of women. And he talks about women cannot speak in the church. That's why they are advocating this women or against this women ordination, and there's a big fight happening in the church because of that, because they use these verses out of context and they don't use it to the totality. But at the end of the day, there are only 3 things: your faith, your hope, and your love for God as well as for your fellow man.